This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to this special edition of NC Spin. With primary elections just 2 days away, we have assembled a panel of experts to talk to you about what we can expect on Election Day. And if there's time, we want to ask about the short session of the legislature convening May 14th. But let's introduce you to our panel. They include John Davis, a longtime observer of state politics and author of the John Davis Political Report, John Hood from the John Locke Foundation, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and Joe Stewart, who himself was actively involved in many political campaigns and is now the executive director of the NC Free Enterprise Foundation. Well, let's start with the headliner event of this election, the GOP Senate primary. With 8 candidates running, the big question is, can a runoff be avoided? John Davis, in your latest newsletter, you predicted House Speaker Thom Tillis will win the 40% he needs to avoid a runoff. Tell us why you say that.
Well, Tillis is a strong candidate, number one. He has 3 years of accomplishment, so I see Tillis like an Olympian that's standing there with gold medals hanging around his neck from 3 years of doing what Republicans could only dream of doing until the takeover of the Senate and House by Republicans after 2010. So, plus he has the money to tell that story. So that's number one. But number two, the hard religious and economic right candidates, like Brannon, like Harris, are out of favor right now because they got the Republican Party into so much trouble in 2012 in those Senate campaigns, and the government shut down. The American public turned on Republicans over the hard Tea Party type economic right. And so Tea Party candidates are out of favor this year. So are the hard social right candidates.
Joe Stewart, this past week was fairly eventful. PPP came up with a poll that showed that Tillis had 46% of the Republican vote. And then the governor came out and all but endorsed. In fact, he did endorse Tillis for the nomination. Is this game over?
Well, I think Tillis has had the advantage of a significant competitive advantage in terms of his personal campaign finance, as well as the various outside groups that have been supportive of his campaign. When you look back in this race, most of these Republican candidates for the U.S. Senate started with relatively low name IDs statewide. Even Speaker Tillis, who had run the state house, had a really low name recognition statewide. So they all had a tremendous mountain to climb in terms of getting their name known among likely Republican primary voters. I think Tillis has just done the best job. He's best positioned to take it over the promised
Chrissy
line.
mentioned the spending from the outside expenditure groups. Some pundit this week said that 90% of all of the TV advertising was being spent by these independent expenditure groups, which means that only 10% actually comes from the candidates. What does this say to us, and what does it say about how much authority and power the candidate actually has in running his own campaign?
Well, it says that this is one of the most important Senate races in the country. I do think that, and we won't talk about this necessarily, but there are a lot of people in the state that don't believe Tillis has medals hanging around his neck. They think that he has bricks around him, and they're going to drag him down the general election. But I think it is likely he's going to get 40%. The other issue we haven't really talked about is that there have been two sort of, Mark Harris, the minister from Charlotte, Greg Brannon, the Tea Party candidate, never had enough money, I don't think, to get their message out effectively around the state. And I think the conservatives sort of, if there is an anti-Tillis part of the Republican Party, was sort of split by both of those. Nobody coalesced around either one of them.
Well, but John, we saw something extremely interesting. Never in my years of covering politics have I seen an incumbent U.S. senator who basically did not have much of a primary election running ads against a candidate of the other party in the primary. Kay Hagan was running ads against Thom Tillis. Does that say that she's believing that Tillis is the only candidate that can beat her?
Well, number one, Tillis is the only candidate that can beat her, and pretty much everybody knows that. Number two, the reason that she did that is not because there was some realization in the Hagan campaign. It's because the people who are in Democratic politics have done this now for many years. They did it in Harry Reid's race. They did it in Claire McCaskill's race in Missouri. This is now a very familiar tactic of intervening in the primary and trying to either damage the nominee that you most don't want to see, or try to get somebody nominated who can't beat you in the fall, which is what happened in Missouri. So this is not unprecedented nationally, just maybe the first time it was done here to this degree.
All right, I want to ask each of you before we run out of time in this segment. Let's play what if. What if Tom Tillis does prevail, as most of you think he will, in the nomination for the primary? So let's move ahead to the general election in November. Tell us what you think we can expect, what the issues are going to be, and how everybody's going to play in this. John, I'll start with you.
Well, it's a tough year for Democrats. It's a midterm election. No Democrat has won in a U.S. Senate race a second term since Sam Ervin in 1968.
This is a one-and-done seat.
Well, and then the White House, of course, the party in the White House, they always lose about 4 Senate seats and 32 House seats. So it's a tough year for the party in the White House. So just going into the fall, the turnout favors an older, more conservative type voter. So this just starts out to be a year that I think Tillis is favored to pull it off.
All right, Chris.
I think it'll be very close, and one of the issues is going to be, we haven't heard a lot about Tillis's legislative record. It might be popular in the Republican primary, but there are a lot of things this General Assembly did that's not popular, certainly with Democrats, but also moderates. And the second issue is Tillis was pushed a little bit to the right here. He talked about not only not supporting a minimum wage increase, but not supporting a minimum wage at all. Some people on this panel might think that's a good idea. I don't think the majority of North Carolinians do. He came out in favor of a personhood amendment, which means a fertilized egg is a person. That's not going to be very popular in the fall. So he's been pushed to the right some, and you'll see all those things. And one more thing you didn't see in the primary, Tillis said a couple years ago we need to divide and conquer poor people, to get poor people to look down on other poor people. That's another piece of rhetoric.
Chris raises a good point, and I want to ask you what you think is going to happen, but he raises a good point. Tillis has gone pretty far to the right. Can he come back to the center to get unaffiliated voters?
I think he will. That's a natural trajectory of candidates of either party, having to go to their base one direction, left or right, to come back to the center for the fall. We're going to see such a tremendous amount of money spent from outside sources in this election, 50, 60, maybe $70 million.
Already more than we've ever seen before in a Senate election.
I think the issues that will manifest themselves in the fall probably are not even known to us yet. I mean, there's so much attention focused on North Carolina, in part because the partisan balance of power of the U.S. Senate probably, at least in part, rests in the outcome of this election. But I think you'll find that the key to this election will be, after the primary, how quickly can the Republican candidates coalesce around their new standard bearer for the election in the fall?
And you think they will?
Well, if they can come together effectively and quickly to start the campaign for the fall sooner rather than later, I think it stands to reason that Tillis has a very strong chance in the fall.
John, tell us what to expect.
I think the Republicans coalesce quickly. The primary, despite Democratic attempts to make it so, was never particularly bitter, and I don't think it'll be that big a deal after the Tillis probable nomination. As far as the fall is concerned, we haven't mentioned yet the actual issues that are likely to be the main ones, which is going to be the national economy, President Obama, Obamacare, budget and tax issues at the federal level. Obviously, Kay Hagan and allies of hers are going to try to make it about the legislature, but I suspect that most voters electing a U.S. senator will be voting on federal issues.
All right, is Obamacare going to be the big issue?
That's going to be the number one issue in the race.
You think?
I think people are a little bit tired of hearing about it, frankly, and we'll see what happens and what the perception of the Affordable Care Act, I think, will be slightly different in the fall than it is now.
I disagree. I think it's jobs in the economy still. Too many Americans are still worried about pocketbook issues, and the Affordable Care Act could be a positive by the fall.
Yeah. I think there is a significant portion of the voters that are going to vote on the ACA. They're against the current administration.
Remember, NC Spin is now being aired on Time Warner cable systems in all markets except the Raleigh-Durham area. To learn the time and channel listing, you can consult the NC Spin website. You can also watch NC Spin anytime you want on Time Warner On Demand or the ncspin.com website. We post each week's show on Friday, so view us anytime you like. And while at ncspin.com, be sure to sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle, and follow us on Twitter at NCSpin Tweets or NCSpin on Facebook. We want to hear from you. When we come back, we'll begin our rundown of individual congressional races.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
It's important for farmers and hunters to work together. Farmers own a majority of North Carolina hunting land, and besides, we're often hunters too. We share the same North Carolina values that we'll pass on to future generations. We share the desire to enjoy the land and our leisure time. Together, we can respect the land, our natural resources, and our privacy.
Every year, North Carolina patients undergo 635,000 same-day surgeries. 72% of these surgeries are performed in our highest-cost hospital facilities, adding as much as $2,000 to every procedure. The state's outdated Certificate of Need law prevents competition from lower-cost, higher-quality same-day surgery centers, inflating healthcare costs and limiting patient choice. Tell state lawmakers it's time to lower healthcare costs now. It's time to make a simple fix to an outdated law, increasing patient choice and lowering healthcare costs now. You can help. Visit reformconnow.com and tell lawmakers it's time for a simple fix to an outdated law. It's time to lower healthcare costs now.
Meet the candidate that public policy polling has shown to have the best chance of defeating Kay Hagan this fall.
While Mayor of Shelby, we cut the crime rate to its lowest rate in 30 years. We created jobs and economic opportunity in an otherwise stagnant economy. I plan to bring the same trust, experience, and determination as your U.S. Senator from North Carolina. I'm Ted Alexander, and I approve this message.
We now return to NC Spin.
All 13 congressional seats are up for election this year, but special attention is being paid to 3 open seats and 2 others that are generating talk. Chris, let's start with the much-anticipated primary between David Rouser and Woody White in the 7th District that Mike McIntyre is vacating. This has gotten very interesting, and even though there's a Democratic primary, nobody's paying attention to it. Handicap this race for us.
Well, it's clearly now, with McIntyre gone, going to be a Republican district unless there's something we haven't figured out yet. The two candidates are David Rouser, a former state legislator who narrowly lost to McIntyre 2 years ago, and Woody White, who I think was appointed briefly to the state General Assembly. He's a trial lawyer, a Republican trial lawyer, very conservative. They both are. Rouser and Independent Expenditures have attacked him for being a trial lawyer. The flip side, Woody White's folks have attacked David Rouser for being a lobbyist. They've said he supports amnesty. They're trying to make him less conservative. They're both throwing a lot of
dirty ads on
really dirty ads. But I think there's one thing I don't want to hold us up too long, but it's fascinating. In a lot of these races where lawyers are running, a lot of people are attacking lawyers for anybody they've ever defended. It's it's really happening all over the country, and it's really happening in this race.
All right, John, let's go to the 6th District with Howard Coble retiring. There are 9 Republicans, 2 Democrats there vying. Phil Berger Jr. seems to be the front runner in most estimations, but this has gotten to be an interesting race. Well,
there's been trades of libel accusations from the Phil Berger Jr. and Bruce Von Cannon, who is a political neophyte but has been spending a lot of his own money. And then there's Mark Walker in the race, who's an activist, has a lot of local support, conservative support. And so that's the structure. Then there's a more moderate Republican candidate, Zach Matheny, who's a longtime Greensboro City councilman. So this is a race that Berger is probably leading in. The only poll that I've seen came from the Berger campaign. But he's probably leading in the race, but I'm not sure yet about whether there'll be a runoff. On the Democratic side, Field, I think is how you pronounce her name, Laura Field. I think she's pretty clearly going to be the nominee on the Democrats.
Joe, I want to move over to the 3rd Congressional District because that one's gotten a little bit interesting. Walter Jones, of course, a long-time 10-term congressman down there in Farmville in eastern North Carolina. This past week, we saw that former vice presidential candidate endorsed him. Is that going to help or hurt Walter Jones and or Taylor Griffin, his opponent?
Well, this is a particularly interesting race for a couple of reasons. Walter Jones has faced primary opponents almost every election cycle, but now he's fallen out of favor with the Republican leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives. Taylor Griffin worked in the Bush administration, has many strong contacts in Washington and national Republican circles, is bringing in money from outside sources and running a very competitive campaign.
This was a big endorsement, though.
Yeah, but I think this is one where perhaps the name recognition, a long-time incumbent, will become a factor in the race. But it's clearly as competitive a primary as Jones has ever faced.
Let's get over to House District 2, John. We've got an interesting race going on there. Not only does Renee Elmas have a primary opponent, but there's an interesting Democratic primary taking place there. Handicap it.
Well, I just see it as a Republican-friendly district. The Democratic primary. It's just hard for me to give it a whole lot of stock. I think Elmer's is going to win the thing.
Let's get in
outright.
here, though. Tell me about Keith Crisco and Clay Aiken. Who's going to come out of that?
Well, probably Crisco. I think the older voters are going to vote. Turnout's only going to be 12-14%. So older voters, people who know Crisco, he had a fairly good reputation. I think he wins it. But Elmer's are clobbering.
Any other congressional seats very quickly that look like they might have any
we've
interest?
got the 12th.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the 12th. Yes.
And this is a
Give me
district,
that
an
one.
African-American district that Mel Watt represented, runs from Charlotte to Greensboro. And those are the two places to think about, because you've got a couple of strong candidates still in Charlotte. Malcolm Graham, the state senator, George Battle, who's the counsel for the school board, I think, in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. And they are on the Charlotte side, which has the bulk of the votes. On the Greensboro side of the district, Alma Adams, a state rep, and Marcus Brandon, a state rep, are in the race. Alma Adams seems to be leading in the polls, again, such that there are any, but whether she'd get to a runoff, I think she's going to probably be pushed into a runoff with one of the two Charlotte candidates.
And interestingly, there's independent expenditure in favoring Adams. It just happened.
All right, we're going to have to take a break. After these messages, we're going to come back and talk about the legislative races.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
It's a contract between generations, between father and son, mother and daughter, that each will take care of the next. Keith Crisco knows firsthand that millions of Americans rely on Social Security and Medicare. That's why in Congress he'll protect these life-saving programs for our seniors and for generations to come. It's a promise we've made to each other, and it's the right thing to do.
I'm Keith Crisco, and I approve this message.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce health care costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. Learn more at accesshealthyfoodsnc.org.
Continuing our coverage of the elections on Tuesday, all 170 seats of the legislature are up for election. Typically in an off-year election, the party out of power in the governor's mansion loses seats. Joe, you track these legislative races carefully. Will Republicans lose seats, and if so, how many in 2014?
Yeah, at this point, it's hard to know accurately what's going to happen in the fall. A lot of what will drive the legislative races will be the top of the ticket race, the U.S. Senate race. But at this point, looking at the various candidates, the campaigns, where there are some relative levels of competitiveness on a partisan basis, I don't think the Republicans will have either significant losses or gains. It may be around net zero for the Republicans.
All right, let's talk about some specific races worth watching. John, you've been tracking some of these. Tee off and give us some.
Well, we mentioned just before the break about the 12th Congressional District congressional race, and two of the people giving up seats in the Greensboro area.
Malcolm Graham and Alma Adams.
That creates open seats in Greensboro with Alma Adams' district and with Marcus Brandon's district. Now, Marcus Brandon, interestingly, his district, Earl Jones, who used to hold that seat in the House, who Brandon beat, is now running to come back in. And in the other district, Ralph Johnson, I think it is, who had run against Alma Adams 2 years ago and done okay, is now probably the leading candidate out of 4. I think he's the only one that doesn't have a criminal conviction, which is probably a selling point. I hope it's a selling point for the legislature. What we want is people to wait until after they get elected to then get criminal convictions.
Get caught.
Absolutely.
All right, Joe, you track a lot of these legislative races. Any you think worth watching?
One House District 82 in Cabarrus County around Concord, you have an incumbent Republican, Larry Pittman, a very Tea Party-oriented Republican, facing a challenge, Lee Brown, a very successful realtor locally, The local Republican Party censured Brown and another local Republican candidate just last week, saying they weren't really Republicans or they weren't Republican enough. But it's a manifestation of really the faction within the Republican Party between Tea Party and more moderate mainstream Republicans.
Well, I think there's an interesting Senate primary in Greensboro. Gladys Robinson, African-American senator, is being challenged by Skip Alston, the former head of the North Carolina NAACP, county commissioner in Greensboro. I think that's going to be a very close primary in an African-American district, so that's one to watch.
John, any you got?
All I want to say is maps plus money equal the majority. Republicans drew the maps, they got the money, they'll keep the majority in both chambers.
There are two other Senate incumbents, Fletcher Hartzell in a Cabarrus County district, Stan Bingham in a Davidson County-based district, that face challengers from the right, and significant, credible challengers from the right. I'm not sure how much trouble they're in, but I do think it's interesting.
This, of course, is just the primary. We'll be talking in more detail about these legislative races after we know who's going to be running against who, although a large number of them don't have any opponents in November. And so we've already elected, 35 or 40% of the total legislature already after the primary elections? Anyway, after these messages, we're going to come back and talk about judicial and local races.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The physician-patient relationship is at the heart of what medicine is about. And so to have a third party telling you, the physician, or you, the patient, where you can have a test, where you can have surgery, or whether you can or cannot, seems completely outside of the realm of reasonable thinking. It's getting a third party who has no business telling us and the patients where to go out of the mix, directly increasing competition, which does nothing but benefit the patient. I'm Dr. Mac Aldridge, and I support CON reform now.
It's true. Farming is different than it was 50 years ago. We know consumers have questions about how our food is grown today. North Carolina livestock farmers want you to know that they're using the most responsible and caring farming practices to feed our state.
NCAnimalAg.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
In 2014, we're going to elect 4 Supreme Court justices, 3 Court of Appeal judges, and there are nonpartisan elections, but only one race on the primary ballot. This one's featuring current Justice Robin Hudson, Jeanette Doran, and Eric Levinson. John, tell us what makes this race interesting and what we can expect.
Well, it's the one to watch for the May primary because the top 2 vote getters will move on to the fall. Levinson and Doran are both Republicans. This is officially nonpartisan, but that's just a sham. Robin Hudson is the Democratic incumbent. And Jeanette Doran, who used to work for the Institute for Constitutional Law, Eric Levinson, who was a former state court of appeals judge, now in the Superior Court, are running campaigns, but they're also being benefited by significant hundreds of thousands of dollars of independent expenditures running against Robin Hudson and to some extent for them.
And Chris, John put his finger on the big issue here, which is the millions of dollars being pumped into this judicial races.
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Well, 650, well,
it's getting pretty doggone close.
650,000 by a Republican group in Washington running ads against Robin
And this
Hudson,
is supposed to be a nonpartisan race.
Well, right. What's fascinating about this is that Republicans are having 2 shots at Justice Hudson because of the primary. They're hoping to knock her out in the May primary when more Republicans are voting because of the Senate race. If that doesn't work, they're going to try again if she manages to survive that primary, they're going to try again in the fall. Jeanette Doran, in her first campaign finance report, had raised, I think, $10,000 or $11,000. Hadn't hardly done much. Her whole campaign is an independent expenditure.
Just remember that Robin Hudson was elected to the court through independent expenditures done on her behalf. So let's not get too carried away with the pristine nature.
Fair for the goose, fair for the gander.
That's right.
All right, some interesting sheriff's races and other races. We've got about a minute and a half left, but anybody want to tee off and give us a couple of interesting local races to watch?
Well, I will say that there's going to be a big fight in Wake County
The district attorney.
County commission.
For the district attorney first, because Colin Willoughby, the longtime DA, has stepped down. And remember, the Wake County DA is not really just a local race, because that's basically the prosecutor, the first prosecutor of record for state of ethics issues, campaign finance irregularities, things like that. There are 4 candidates on the Republican side, 2 on the Democratic side. And in the fall, Wake County will be a significant target for Democrats because they want to take back control of the county commission. They don't expect a lot of legislative gains this year, but they'd like to pick up some county commissions.
Any other local races worth watching? Anybody got any? All right, very quickly, what's the turnout going to be? Brad Crone predicted a couple of weeks ago no more than 20%.
Oh, I think that's the upper range.
That's high. It was 12% in 2006, 14% in 2010, somewhere around there.
Early voting, how's that going?
Early voting seems to be similar to before, even though it's a shorter period of time. People just have gotten to the polls faster. It doesn't seem to have mattered very much.
Big issue of this primary election. Jobs, economy?
Well, people are still upset about the direction of the country, the direction of the state. But Republicans are energized, Democrats are playing defense.
Yeah. So how are things set up for July? Are we going to have runoff elections? How many are going to be there? And
I think there's a likely runoff in the 6th congressional district, as we talked about before. I don't think there'll be one in the Senate race.
And maybe one in the 12th district as well. Right. But the challenge is in the heart of the summer. What's the turnout? People are still hungover from their Bastille Day celebrations.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read our column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And we hope you'll join us next week when we take on more issues of interest, including the election outcomes and the short session of the legislature. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.